satisfying, pleasing to see people able to make ends meet and to see them starving. It's painful to, you know. Now, you've got to take that sort of phenomenon into account. So the factual question becomes one of, are there any human actions that are totally disregarding of all possible self-interest? And Butler's inclined to say no. You see, the egoism is not the view that there is self-interest, but that self-interest is the dominant, overriding, final, all-absorbing concern. So I guess I'm not worried about that.
But what I was thinking of more was, rather than someone who is that good, I was thinking of the opposite, sort of the person who's so malevolent that they would enjoy, they know they would receive pleasure from seeing other people in pain. And so then I'm wondering.
Oh, malevolent.
Yeah, malevolent.
Oh. Yeah, I think that that Hume would argue no. No, that even, and Butler and people like that do as well, even though there are some very sadistic brutes who love to see other people squeal, they still have some degree of benevolence for some, if only a pet dog. You see? That some degree of benevolence is never completely eradicated. The gangster who's got such a soft spot for his own kids, but doesn't think twice about killing a lot of other people. So forth. Yeah. The Hitler who was very tender with his girlfriend. So forth. Well, that's a question of psychological fact. Anything else? Okay, you see what Hume is doing? All right, let me move on then and say just a little about the moral sense philosophers of the 18th century. 4 of them I've mentioned. In actual fact, of course, there were a lot more. But the 4, the Earl of Shaftesbury, Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, that's the Adam Smith of Wealth of Nations. He was professor of moral philosophy at Edinburgh, wrote a book on the theory of moral sentiments. And Joseph Butler. Joseph Butler, who was an Anglican clergyman in a city pulpit in London. Most of his ethical writings that have come down to us are sermons he preached. They are much more like philosophical lectures than like any sermon you heard, I would wager. But that was the 18th century, I guess. All right, so this school of thought, the moral sense philosophers, like David Hume, they are rooting ethics in human psychology, in moral psychology. They're affirming that we have some kind of moral sense in addition to the 5 senses. Some kind of moral sense, sentiment. And as we noted last time, Hume himself uses the phrase moral sense in talking about the sentiments in his own case. Now, this moral sense philosophy seems to have arisen in opposition to Thomas Hobbes' egoism. And in that regard, it sort of picked up the baton from the Cambridge Platonists of the 17th century, whom we talked about a little bit when we were dealing with Locke. The Cambridge Platonists, of course, with their innate ideas, their opposition to the mechanistic view of nature. Broad church people in the Anglican tradition. But with their belief in real universals, therefore objectively real ethical ideals, the Cambridge Platonists were 100% opposed to Thomas Hobbes. But not only to Thomas Hobbes, they were also opposed to the strong Calvinism that had flourished during the Cromwellian Commonwealth. This is true of the moral sense philosophers as well in the 18th century. Opposed to that strong Calvinism with a pessimistic view of human nature that maintained that there is no natural beneficence in human beings, that we're all completely egoistical. Now you see the issue facing up, egoism versus altruism. I remember when I was in graduate school, I heard a lecture by one of the early 20th century descendants of those moral sense philosophers, a Britisher called Broad, B-R-O-A-D, C.D. Broad. And he was lecturing on the question, egoism or altruism, question mark. You see, and he argued that he was either some sort of an egoistical altruist or some kind of an altruistical egoist. He wasn't quite sure which. But the method of his reasoning was by appealing to what seemed to him perfectly obvious. That is to say, we have a moral sense that enables us to perceive when we understand a situation what's right. Moral sense. Yes, in Broad's day it was called intuition. So the 20th century descendants of this are called ethical intuitionists. You see, ethical intuitionists. Broad was one of them. We'll meet a couple of others of them later on, G.E. Moore, W.D. Ross. But the moral sense philosophers, anticipating that, you see, are talking of a natural kind of benevolence that is inherent in our moral sensitivity. We're benevolent because of this moral sense, this moral faculty, which enables us to perceive the right from the wrong. The moral faculty, indeed, has three functions. It enables us to perceive the moral quality of an action, a situation. It enables us to approve or disapprove of that action or situation, and it motivates us to do what is good in regards to that situation. So it involves perception, moral perception, knowing the right, the good, moral approbation, making moral judgments, and moral motivation. So that again, as you can see, the moral knowledge comes there, and the ought, the obligation, comes from both the judgment and the motivation. And you'd have to translate the notion of duty or obligation to the motivation. I've got to do this, the motivation which drives. Now, on this account, beneficence is not reducible to things like pleasure or self-interest, David. It doesn't rule it out, but it's not reducible just to that. It wasn't for Hume either. The moral sense is a kind of sui generis thing. It's distinctive. It's not reducible to any other human faculty. It's simply part of how God made us to function. So while you still have the ethical subjectivism, like in Hume, there's a theistic basis for it, which makes the motivation and approbation much more weighty than would have been otherwise. Now, while that's the overall picture for these moral sense people, there is still a major question which divided them. The question is whether this moral sense is basically cognitive or emotive. Is it a matter of reason or is it a matter of emotion? The same question as David Hume was dealing with. And on that issue, the ones who said it's basically non-cognitive, a matter of taste, matter of sentiment, though universal, were Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, the first two that I've got up here. Adam Smith as well, though not as fully, not as clearly. But at least there are writers like Thomas Reid, the Scottish realist, who accuse him of having this ethic of feeling rather than of knowledge. On the other hand, Butler, and as we'll see, Thomas Reid in Scottish realism, who is very similar to this on ethics, Butler and Reid both say that this sense is a cognitive faculty, that it is a kind of knowing, not a kind of feeling. It involves ideas, clear ideas, rather than just some feelings of pleasure or pain. Or what is it that good taste provides feeling of? If it's taste, good taste is what? Satisfaction? Pleasure? It's hard to avoid the term pleasure if you're talking of the emotive. So this is the issue over which they divided. Now, of these people, you might find Joseph Butler perhaps particularly interesting, bishop in the Church of England that he was. And for some people he's of interest because he uses the word conscience to denote, to name the moral sense. This moral sense that we all have is conscience. And he goes to great lengths in developing this, and you can see how it parallels the kind of thing which Hume and the others are up to. Conscience for